Tonight we're going to look at television from a very critical vantage point. My guest is Wendell Johnson, former commissioner of the F.C.C., now publisher of a magazine called Access, which talks about the public's right to the airwaves through television and radio stations, and also an organization called Media Watch, newsletter of the National Citizens Committee for Broadcasting. So tonight's your night out there to find out what you can do about what you don't like about Channel 4 and all the other channels in this country. And welcome to Montage.
Thank you very much.
Do you find a lot of broadcasters a little apprehensive to have you on a program?
Yes, I was going to begin by saying I appreciate either your confidence, your courage, your naivete, or your darn foolishness to let me on here at all. See, so I appreciate that. We don't get on very often.
Well, that's kind of sad. Now that bothers me.
Well, it really is. As a matter of fact, you know, I don't think a responsible broadcaster has anything to fear at all from healthy public participation in the process. We've got one of the trends of what's been going on in the country the last 5-10 years has been a desire on the part of people to participate in all the major institutions that affect their lives. Employees want to have more impact on the workplace. Students want to have more impact on educational institutions. Consumers want to have more impact on their stores where they do business. Beef boycott that was held. People want to stop freeways or start them or whatnot. And we're learning that we can control the environment and the community we live in and the way in which we live, and that we don't have to just sit back and take it, that there are tools and ways of going about changing things that work.
Well, now, when you were appointed to the F.C.C., you very quickly developed a reputation as being a rabble-rouser. I'll use the phrase for want of a better one. But you were kind of shaking the establishment up. Did you do that on purpose?
Well, I did what I did on purpose. Yeah. All I did was just I would hold public readings from the Constitution of the United States and the United States Code, Acts of Congress, and I would tell people what the law said the rights were. And as a result of that, I was called a radical because, of course, you're not supposed to let the people know what the law says. They might go applying it. The law in the case of broadcasting gives the public much greater rights than they have even with regard to freeways and supermarkets and environmental pollution. Because the law with regard to broadcasting says in the very first section of the act having to do with radio and television stations that nobody can own a radio or television station. There will be no right of property in the license, the act says. What that means in practical effect is that every 3 years this station and every other television station in the United States lose their right to broadcast, have to come into the F.C.C. as if they were a new applicant for a station, ask for a license for another 3-year period, much the same way as a member of Congress has to run for office every 2 years. You don't have a right to be reelected to Congress, and you don't have a right to be reelected to be a broadcaster in this community. And once the public knows that there is a license renewal process and that the public can participate in that license renewal process, then you begin to have a really meaningful dialogue between all the segments of the society and the broadcaster who so affects that society. You know, I walked into your lobby. I made note of this because I thought it was so good. It's written by your president, Michael Wolfson.
Mitchell Wolfson.
Mitchell? Mitchell,
yeah.
Forgive me. We wouldn't want to get that wrong. It's called the Wometco Philosophy, and in it it says, we realize fully that we are responsible for the economic, political, and social climate in which we operate. Now, I've never heard a broadcaster come straight out and admit that before, but that's the truth. The fact is that television does shape the social, political, and economic climate in which all of us have to live.
What do you think of most television programs on the air today?
Well, I think the basic problem with television is its dependence upon commercialism. That affects what programs get on the air, what programs don't. It affects what gets censored out of programs and what gets put into programs. It affects all kinds of things, the kinds of public service announcements that can be run. Public service announcements are prepared by the same advertising agencies, the same corporations that are putting on all the other commercials.
Do you agree with former Commissioner Minow, Chairman Minow, saying this is a vast wasteland, television?
Well, that was a cute phrase. When he left office, you know, the last question he was asked at his last press conference was, Chairman Minow, do you still think that it is a vast wasteland? And he said, no, I think as a result of our efforts here, it is now can fairly be characterized as only a half-vast wasteland. So he felt there's been some progress made. I think there has. I think that we now have hundreds of groups around the country that are involved in media reform activities of various kinds that the National Citizens Committee for Broadcasting has set up to try to service. And I think they are having an impact.
But do you think they're having too much of an impact? I do hear broadcasters say that it's really no longer free enterprise at all. It's just really a government-controlled entity.
Well, we're not talking about government control now. We're talking about just exactly the opposite. We're talking about the philosophy of Ronald Reagan and George Wallace and others that are trying to break down the federal government and put power back in the communities and back in the hands of the people. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about groups here in Miami that are concerned about employment practices for women and blacks, that are concerned about children's programming, that are concerned about over-commercialization, that are concerned about the erosion of family and moral values in our society. Groups in Miami being able to come in and deal with the station manager of this station and the other stations in this community one-on-one and have it out with them right here in Miami. We're not talking about some far-off in Washington government agency having some kind of control.
Well, but there are regulations imposed by the F.C.C.
The regulations require you to sit down and talk with the public. That's what the regulations are, and I think those kind of regulations are perfectly appropriate. They don't bother me a bit.
Yeah, I agree. I think some journalists, I'm a journalist, have some trouble with dividing the rights of the printed press, which have no encumbrances whatsoever, and the journalistic rights in broadcasting, which are encumbered or enhanced, whichever way you want to look at it, but do have some regulations they have to adhere to. Do you see any problems there in the free press?
Well, the big difference is that anybody who wants to can try to start a newspaper. Now, they may go bankrupt.
Yeah.
But anybody who tries to start a television station in Miami today is not only going to go bankrupt, they're also going to go to jail. Because you have to have a license to operate a station.
Yeah.
And therein lies an enormous difference. There have, in fact, been a new rash of suburban newspapers, underground newspapers, and so forth. There have not been in radio and television stations. There are more people that want to operate them than there are stations available to be licensed. And that means necessarily that when you operate this station, you do it as very much like a public utility. The Supreme Court has said there is no right of private censorship in a medium that's not open to all. That you have an obligation under the Fairness Doctrine to deal with controversial issues of public importance in this community. And you have an obligation under the ascertainment requirements to go out and talk to the people in this community, to figure out what are the most important problems and how you can make the greatest contribution to making Miami more responsive to the people that live here and make it better, get closer to the ideals and what they'd like to make of it. And those are responsibilities that fall upon you because you are sort of in a monopoly or an oligopoly. There are only just a handful of you here, and you've got all the power. And that means that you've got to be like a public utility. You've got to be open to all points of view. The Fairness Doctrine says that you not only have to deal with controversial issues of public importance, but that when you do it, you have to give an opportunity for all points of view to be heard.
What do you think of the Family Hour controversy?
I think it's fraud.
Do you think Family Hour worked?
No.
Why?
I think it was worked out in secret session between the chairman of the F.C.C. and the heads of the networks to defraud the American people and divert their attention from a very serious problem, which is the matter of violence and what television is doing to our religious and family values in this country. There's a need for an exercise of some responsibility on the part of the networks, and they had to come up with something. They didn't want to take any effective action, and they did this. They did it illegally without holding hearings on it. It's now being contested in court, and I suspect the court's going to find that it was illegal. It's been opposed by church groups and as well as National Citizens Committee for Broadcasting and others.
Were you forced off the F.C.C.? I know your term expired, but...
No, you have a 7-year term.
Did you want
and
to
my term expired June 30th of 1973, and no replacement was forthcoming, so under law you continue to serve until a replacement does come. I stayed on until December. There was still no replacement. They were hung up. Nixon wouldn't withdraw this appointee he wanted to put on who was out of the broadcasting industry. Preposterous notion. You take a broadcasting company executive and put him on the Federal Communications Commission. The Senate wouldn't even hold hearings, let alone approve him. Nixon was too stubborn to withdraw the name. And so it just finally seemed to me the only thing I could do is just leave and walk out of there, and then at least hearings would have to be held, and it would kind of move the thing along.
Don't you miss being a commissioner with all the
No,
the
I
inherent power that goes
did
with
it
that?
for 7.5 years, and you know, it's time to move on and do something else. So I moved my act down the street, and we're...
Would you represent one of the networks if they came to you as a lawyer and asked you to take their
No, I've
case?
devoted my life to media reform. I had the opportunity that every commissioner has to take the $150,000 a year job in industry as a lawyer, a corporate executive. I decided the public paid to give me the background and experience that I've got with this, and the luck that's come my way and the education I had and the experiences I had as a law clerk on the Supreme Court and so forth. And I'd rather take that experience and use it to serve the public. And so that's what I'm doing with the National Citizens Committee for Broadcasting, National Citizens Communications Lobby, Access Magazine, Media Watch. I do public speaking around the country on
How can people
these
reach
subjects.
you? Where do they write to you?
Well, thank you. I'm glad you
contact
asked.
you?
It's just 1346 Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C.
Nicholas Johnson.
Yeah, Nicholas Johnson, 1346 Connecticut Avenue, Washington, D.C.
We have to pause just a moment for a message. We'll be right back.